Hello and welcome back to another section of notes. Today we are covering the Enlightenment and really basically what is it as we go forward. There'll be two other parts to this where we'll talk a little bit about Enlightenment thinkers and the legacy, but let's dive into the Enlightenment. So again, when we focus on the Enlightenment and try to understand what it is, again, the important thing to know is, again, it's tied into this time period that we focused on in our last section. Scientific revolution takes place. We start to see that scientific method is what gets adopted for us to answer questions about what's going on in the world. The big question becomes, okay, well, if we can use that process of observation, right, questioning and coming up with a hypothesis, and then experimenting about the physical world, things in the sciencey realm, what else could we explain that way? And this really comes about as to what's known as the Age of Reason, okay, or oftentimes also called the Enlightenment. Why? Right? People are using reason and thought instead of tradition to explain the world and the way our systems work, okay? What are our institutions going to look like? And basically what happens is you have educated people at this time that start to use reason and they start to look into human and human behavior, okay? More so philosophy, political science, sociology, those types of things, okay? To try to figure out, okay, what is the best way to set up a government, right? How should humans and their behavior influence who has power in decisions, okay? This idea of like, all right, what should politics really look like? And these ideas on government are extremely varied. We'll talk a little bit about this with two main individuals first, okay? Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. They're the quintessential examples of kind of this thinking during the Enlightenment. You have two Englishmen, okay? And they both start to really express their ideas during this time. And the reason they express these ideas is because they both lived through a very traumatic, right, or meaningful event for them in their country, but also personally. During the English Civil War, they overthrow the absolute monarchy. There's drastic changes in what's going on with the government. We have the Commonwealth, and then the Glorious Revolution that comes about with the constitutional monarchy and the English Bill of Rights. And both of these guys come away with the conclusion that the role of government is very, very important in society. What they differ with is, what does that really look like as it relates to human behavior? Thomas Hobbes looks at it from the standpoint of looking at humans from kind of this pessimistic lens, saying that people and their natural human behaviors, that, again, if we are boiling this down to say that humans like almost in their wild state, that if we were not in civilization anymore, our base traits would be selfish and wicked. And that because of the fact that we're these kind of bad people at our core, right, or we act at least in selfish ways, that government is needed. And the reason that government's needed is basically to keep law and order. So how does this really work? Well, if people are selfish and wicked, and they're giving all their power away, what are they getting back? And essentially this idea is that with a system of government that Thomas Hobbes is arguing for, he says people agree to hand over their rights and their freedoms. In return, they get law and order, that they get some sort of stability. And because people are always going to do the wrong thing, if they're left to their own devices, they really don't need a say in what's going on in the government anyway. This is really where we see kind of a justification for keeping with this absolutist rule. Why? Because if people are going to make bad decisions, right, what do? Well, you make sure that they can't make decisions by having an absolute monarch that makes all the rules. And in that case, you have an absolute monarch who will keep things under control, keeps all the power with them, keeps it usually for a long period of time, and it kind of smooths things out. This concept, he coins the Leviathan, okay? This idea that a country or society is made up of a bunch of people, but they willingly agree to give up their autonomy to be part of one larger body, okay, with the head basically still being the monarch, okay, that controls what goes on. they're a part of it, but again, they're giving up their autonomy to be a part of the system. So John Locke comes to a different conclusion, and this conclusion essentially is this idea that people are innately decent, right? Or at least they're decent enough where they can continue to learn and improve. Okay? We've seen lots of improvement through the scientific revolution, so a lot of people can do this. So, all right, what that really looks like on paper, though, is a different social contract. So instead of the social contract that Hobbes talks about, where people are exchanging their rights and freedoms for law and order or stability, Locke says that the arrangement is that people gain power by protecting the rights of others. And essentially what these rights are life, liberty, and property. Sounds somewhat familiar to some things that we'll talk about in the future. And the idea is that everybody is born with these rights, that they are natural rights, and that the government's job is to protect those natural rights. People can overthrow the government when it doesn't do that, okay? So if the government's not following those rules, right, they can be removed from power because they're not following that arrangement. And this is really where we start to see kind of this rise in more democratic governments kind of making an appearance in Europe at this time. Why? Right? Because people are kind of yearning for this idea of like participatory government. The Enlightenment also moves to France, right? That a lot of these ideas start in England, but we see that they move to France and they really kind of explode from there. Why? Well, French society is set up in a way at this time where there's a lot of discussion or ability for ideas to move around. There's a culture kind of around this idea of discussing politics and philosophy. You have people that are called philosophers, and despite this idea that they are thinking and discussing new types of governments and whatnot, they are having to meet in secret. Why? Because they still have an absolute monarchy in France. You can't get that mixed up. But they're still very interested in these ideas and acquiring this knowledge. And they have these salon gatherings where they're meeting oftentimes in women's homes to discuss these ideas in private. So the legacy of this. Why do we care about the Enlightenment and kind of where does it move from here? Well, again, it's an idea that comes about and it really challenges social equity, it challenges government, it challenges society. Okay? Again, we're moving in progress for equality. We're also moving towards more secular life, okay, away from the church. We also see another idea creep back, an idea that kind of echoes from things that we already talked about with the Renaissance as well, right, with this idea of individualism, right, using your own abilities to think about right and wrong, not what others tell you, okay, but basically using your own abilities to come to your own conclusions. So I hope you enjoyed this section of notes, and we'll jump back in with part 3 later.